Hello, friends, and welcome back to the Learning Future podcast. I'm your host, Luca Parry. Today, I'm really excited to be hosting a wonderful designer, scientist, innovator, educator. Her name is Leticia Britos Cavagnaro, and she is working at the Stanford D School. She's actually created and facilitated a wide range of learning experiences in design, creativity, and innovation at that wonderful place, which is such a creative hotspot at the Stanford D School. Her creative methods include the use of emerging technologies to help people grow as self-directed, action-oriented, reflective, and responsible shapers of the future. She co-directs the University Innovation Fellows Program and is an adjunct professor at the D School. And she has a PhD in developmental biology from Stanford University and is a former member of the Research in Education and Design Lab. Fantastically, I also have in my hand her new book, which is called Experiments in Reflection: How to See the Present, Reconsider the Past, and Shape the Future. And it's part of the Stanford D School Guide series that we've been profiling over the last 12 months or so now. It's newly released and it is absolutely beautiful. Leticia, wonderful to have you with us to have a conversation.
Thank you, Luke. I'm so excited to be here.
So many wonderful things to dive into, including about reflection. So first question, of course, is a reflective one. What is something that you've been learning recently as someone that's really at the forefront of experimentation?
Yeah. So right now I'm spending some weeks in Uruguay, in my home country. And one thing that it's in my mind, on my mind right now, is how much we can learn through conversations. And as it happens here, our customs here and the pace of living really is much more conducive to just sitting down and chatting with people, right? Informally, at the beach, while you're having, after having lunch. So you might have like a 2-hour lunch and like really spend some time chatting. So in the past few weeks, I've had many conversations with family, with friends, and across all ages, from like my 12-year-old niece to my father just earlier today. And it really strikes me how important it is that we learn a lot, right? Like if we really lean into listening, right? And being present and asking good questions, right? And those are all like skills that I think that the education system should do a better job of helping us develop, right? But yeah, that's something that I've been reading. I wouldn't say like this is something I learned, but it's something that I continue to gather evidence for, right? That this is such an important way of learning through conversation.
Yeah, it feels like, and there's something I'd love you to reflect more on. The kind of first step of any futures work that we're really interested in, of course, is how do you notice? It's the first part of your book as well. And even the idea of like slow looking or like presencing, right? Or even having like I don't get a bit technical, like a psychophysiological coherent state. So rather than being kind of disembodied, there's this real interesting piece I'd love you to kind of keep going on around embodiment. The idea of presence in a world that is constantly distracting and notifications dinging everywhere, and all of us setting far too many goals to try to achieve. And especially when we think about, our education systems and the amount, I would say, of like the breadth of things that educators are trying to support young people to understand across their cognitive, social, emotional health. What's your kind of your piece on this, on noticing? And feel free to take us into some of the practices as well that you suggest.
Yeah, and as you mentioned, so the book, Experiments in Reflection, I at the beginning, when as I was starting to write the book, I was thinking, well, if the book is about reflection, I need to define it or use a definition. And I soon realized like it was not going to work to really just take one of the popular definitions. Let's take like Dewey's definition of reflection or Chun's definition of reflection, because not only they're overly academic, but I decided to pivot from that and really draft or craft a definition of my own that really allowed people to grasp reflection and apply it and build it into their practice, right? Like, so the definition of reflection that I use in the book starts with saying it's a whole body process of transforming experience into meaning to shape futures, in order to shape futures. And I think like that first part, whole body process, is really about understanding that we need to learn and to live with our whole body. And oftentimes, like in the education system, we're thinking about, like, as if the students were like their brains only, or like these disembodied intelligences. But really what we when we need to lean into kind of like, how do we kind of like sense with our whole body, how do we take in information and practice that, right? Like the same way that we practice other skills, how do we practice noticing, how do we practice paying attention? And it's not just about fixing our attention in one spot, but as has been shown by amazing researchers like Ellen Langer, it's about like shifting your perspective, kind of like focusing and refocusing, right? Like, so one of the experiments in the book, it's about like taking how photographers work, for instance, in like thinking about like different, how you change your focus, how you look at things from different angles, how you add some filters, and using that same strategy to focus our attention and thinking about like, how can I look at this situation from a different point of view, right? From a different vantage point, from the perspective of someone else that it's across the table, or from thinking about the organization and the system, and kind of like, and thinking about, well, how can we think about it through the lens of our, learners, but also from the lens of like the teachers, and from like all of the different perspectives. So I think it's really important to think of ourselves as like, take advantage of our whole body.
Absolutely. It's actually reminds me of something I heard Sir Ken Robinson say once, which was sometimes we just think that our bodies are just to move our brain around. And like that's the only reason they exist. It's just to kind of move it, move the brain.
Yeah.
And the whole field of embodied cognition in particular, and I'm very interested, be it, and situated cognition, distributed cognition, this idea of thinking together, thinking with your body, thinking in spaces. I really I reflected on that as I read through the first part of the book. The other piece that I'm so interested in, and I think it's something that we can talk more about, is this: whenever we think of change, right? And clearly in our world right now, we're all called to do things differently, perhaps even be different. The role of the teacher, the way we focus on curriculum and school systems, even the way we interact with technology across the board. Is this thing that you were just speaking to, which is the distinction between perception and perspective. And I think sometimes we all get stuck in perception, which is, no, I'm seeing the truth. Whereas what I'm seeing is my perception of said truth. And someone else has a completely different view. And I think, to come back to your first piece, the power of conversations is that we engage in dialogue. And what we do is we share two perceptions and we start to take perspective. And that seems to be like a meta level of understanding, and certainly something we can cultivate more, be it metacognition in our young, them thinking about their thinking, meta learning, them learning about their learning. But this idea is, how do you kind of, I don't know, hold on to your perspective, your perception lightly, and realize that, well, you're only ever seeing part of the picture.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that has to do, what you're mentioning has to do also with that second dimension of reflection that I explore in the book, of making sense, right? And going from what you notice to how do you make sense of it. And it's about really finding very like different meanings, not just like one interpretation, right? Like, but really a diversity of possibilities, right? And this divergent thinking, I think, is like what really we need to help, like use more, and invite our students to use more, so that they can kind of like hold on to even like things that might be feel incompatible, or perspectives that can feel incompatible, and not kind of like have
Yeah.
implode on that perspective of like, I have these two interpretations, and they might contradict one another, but I can still hold them and stay there in the discomfort of kind of like, I wonder what this means, and which one is kind of like helps me see it's more helpful, instead of like thinking just on right and wrong, right? Like, but like looking at like different degrees of possibility.
I love a few I don't know who the quote's from, but it's this idea of a first-rate intelligence is to hold two ideas in mind without accepting either one. And there is something
Mm,
about, I guess, the modern world and even kind of the skill of discernment is to be able to sit with cognitive dissonance. Well, I'm going to
mhm.
consider these two views and continue to consider them and not necessarily wed myself to one immediately and then
Yes.
be triggered if you challenge my viewpoint. And I think this is like, how do we disagree better, Leticia, is one
Yeah.
question that I always sit with. And I think slowing ourselves down to be able to reflect deeply seems to be one of
Hmm.
the ways to do that, especially when it comes to sense making. Take us into that sense making space a little bit more. So if it's first
Hmm.
about noticing, right, and like
Hmm.
I don't know, interoception in terms of the body, but
Yeah.
even
Yeah.
introspection.
Yeah.
If we're talking about, okay, well, why would I believe, that noticing your own biases even, how
Hmm.
do you take them into kind of the physical world as you've suggested through a few experiments, take them
Yeah.
from the
Yeah.
mind into a space where you can look
Yeah.
at them and go, oh,
Hmm. Yeah, I think it's going from, seeing what is to what could be, right? And going into that, conditional space. And there's, of course, many, many ways of doing that. I think that one very powerful way is the power of asking questions, and reframing things as questions, and asking a diversity of questions, and right, like, and different questions. And there's actually, research on how questions, for instance, helped designers understand, make more useful products, for instance. But more generally, like how different questions, like asking ourselves, what if, right? Like triggers, thought experiments, right? Like that allow us to kind of like
mm,
consider different, possibilities, different possible scenarios, right? Or asking, one question that we love in design, as you probably know, is like, how might we, right?
yeah,
Like that, like every single word of that question unlocks something. It has a very intentional role, right? Like how is like how invites, actually finding solutions. Might is like, well, this might work or might not work,
hmm,
right? It's not like how will be. It's like not something that
yes,
is certain, but we're trying something innovative. And we is about, working with others, right? Like in innovating with others. So but when we think about, like, for instance, recognizing, we might be at a meeting, and we might say, like, our meetings are really unproductive, right? And or we can say, how might we make our meetings more productive, right? And
yeah,
we're sort of like, acknowledging the same kind of reality, if you will, right? But if we phrase it as questions, then it invites us to go into a different mode, right? Like for
mm,
others and for ourselves, right? Like, so, and really like this inviting possibility. So
mm,
asking questions to ourselves, and asking questions to others. I think it's a powerful way of kind of like this process of making sense of what we notice. Also the power of language, right? Like, so metaphors, for instance, there's
mm,
one of the experiments in the book. It's about creating, creating sort of connections, or unexpected connections, using metaphors, and using images that are drawn by words, to make connections that you would not normally make. So, like in
mm,
in the experiment, I invite you to make a metaphor maker that combining, verbs in nouns or different words, and kind of like using those to kind of like, and thinking about a situation that you have and say like, how is this like a beautiful mirror, let's say, whatever like metaphor you get randomly, and then like allowing to form that connection, even if you're forcing it, because that's how, we learn new things, right? Like creating new connections. But for instance, I think the power of language is very important when we teach as teachers, to recognize that when we use absolute language versus conditional language in our teaching, we're really changing or sending a message to the students that is very important. And this is Ellen Langer from Harvard has done a lot of work in this sense. But if we say, these are the 3 ways of looking at this, is very different than saying like, this can be seen in these 3 ways, which implies like there's opportunity to see it in like the 4th and the 5th and the 6th way. So it's inviting the student or the learner to really think about like, there's space for more, there's space for other perspectives, and it's not like this is the interpretation of something. So really thinking about like how we use language, and inviting others, and inviting, in this case, learners, into this sense-making process that is so important, to go beneath the surface, right? Like, and not looking at things, taking things literally too much.
It's I'm so curious, as I really want you to speak a bit more on, we talked about imagination and divergent. Well, you write about this, imagination, divergent thinking. And I think what I'd love for you, for those listening, educators and innovators that kind of don't understand the difference between convergent and divergent thinking, I'd love your reflection on that, because I feel as a teacher, as teachers, I feel that a lot of the system has been based on convergent thinking. And we end up in this space where what young people end up trying to do is find the right answer, instead of explore the problem space and look at a whole range of possible questions. Is that would you agree with that statement? And B, like, how would you discern between kind of convergence and divergence?
Yeah. And well, very simply, right? Like, you converge towards one thing, right? And you diverge towards multiple things, right? Like, you kind of like start in one place and it's like, well, and go in different directions. It could be interpretations of something you notice, or it could be ideas for new things or solutions, right? And it's understandable that convergence often feels more comfortable, right? From the emotional point of view, or the affective point of view, right? That is like, okay, I'm going towards knowing, or it's like, okay, this is the answer. But I think that most of the learning should be about being in these uncomfortable places that are places of possibility, right? Like, so inviting our students to kind of like say, well, we're going to give you, let's say, a challenge or exploration space, but you have to define even what question you're interested in, right? That might be very, very uncomfortable, right? And I think it's our job to kind of like create the conditions and create the support structures to actually help students remain in that discomfort and find their way through that, productive struggle. And there's research on that, right? Like, there's research on that productive struggle that, and for instance, in math education, right? Like that, when students are walk through and lecture through a way of solving a problem, they might be they might understand what the teacher did, but then if you compare with a group that was given a problem and given the opportunity to struggle with solving it, they might struggle with that particular problem, but then, when presented with a new type of problem, they're more successful than those who were lectured, right? Because they have, actually, the learning might not feel like, it might not feel that you learned how to solve the problem, but actually in the struggle, you develop strategies that are transferable, right? The same way that there's, studies that show that there's a difference between learning and the perception of learning, which is really interesting. And for instance, this is a study from Harvard in a physics class, right? Like comparing, again, like a lecture-based class and an active learning class on the same topic. And then the two groups of students receiving both different types of teaching were asked, like, how much did you learn and how much did you how good do you think the teacher is? How much did you like the experience? And those who got the lecture, they thought they learned more and they liked the lecturer more and they liked the experience more. But then when they were tested, actually those who did the active learning were the ones that, objectively learn more in the same test, right? So it's kind of like when we think we learn and when and what we actually learn are different. And I think we need to recognize that and build that into our teaching.
I mean, I love the we spoke with Professor Stephanie Jones from the Easel Lab at Harvard recently. We talked a lot about grappling as one of the key acts of learning. And
yeah,
I was thinking of Professor Manya Kapoor's work on productive struggle as well. I was going to ask the question and you brought it up, which is brilliant. Because I figure, Leticia, someone that supported many different professors and lecturers from universities around the world as the University Innovation Fellows Program to try to kind of change the way of teaching from this kind of lecture-based model to a more experiential model. What do you see as the key factors to help people in that journey? Because it's the same question in K to 12. It feels safer, potentially, is the hypothesis, feels safer and even like more effective to teach in a kind of clearly instructed way. But of course, what we're discovering from the learning sciences is that might be true in the short term, but it doesn't actually build the capability and certainly the meta capabilities that we want. So what do you how do we support teachers, or if as teachers ourselves, what's the journey to that space?
Yeah. And I think there's this disconnect on one hand between research and researchers, right, in education, and teachers and practitioners, in the sense that, there's a lot of, when I read papers, right, like it's like, oh my God, this is so interesting. And it took me, and at the same time, it was so difficult to find this paper, right? Probably this paper is going to be read by very few people, by very few teachers, right? Like, so that they need, so there's that disconnect. And so I think that the key, the missing ingredient is that teachers need to be experimenters in their practice, right? Like that needs something that all teachers need to be required to do, like be experimenters, trying different things, and because that is going to also inform researchers, like, well, there's something here, we probably should do a controlled, designed controlled study about this, but it's kind of like coming from the practice, and at the same time kind of like also kind of like using that the actual systemic control science to inform teachers. But the teachers need to be experimenters, and I'm not sure that that's part of like how we prepare teachers, right? So we have like some that are experimenters, but like for the most part it seems like, okay, we need to kind of like be it's kind of like be following a program, or for delivering something that is that is stable and everyone is getting the same, and I think that actually does a disservice to learners. And the other disconnect for me, for teachers at all levels, is that oftentimes, like, we as teachers do not experience experiential learning. So for instance, I might go to a conference and you hear a lecture on experiential learning. It's like, wait, what? It's like, no, that means that probably that teacher does not do experiential learning if they're doing a lecture on it, right? Like, you have to, and so I think that teachers are often not exposed as learners to the kind of learning that would be most beneficial to their students, right? Like, so we need to
That's a great point.
like think about teacher education and training in kind of like mirroring the learning that we want them to create for their students, right? It cannot be kind of like a theoretical thing that then they need to figure out how to translate. I think it would be important to think about how do we get better at supporting learning and not really think about the teaching as the delivery or the facilitation of an activity, but about like the designing of the space and the finding the resources and all of those other things that are not just like delivering or talking to the students or even giving instructions or right, like, but all of those other elements of creating the space where the learning happens, right? And that often, I mean, we have at the D school, all of the classes are taught in teams, right? Like it might be 2 teachers, 3, even more, and oftentimes like the who is at a given time in front of the, or at least this is the case in my teams, who is delivering a particular set of instructions or an activity. We might decide that, at the last minute, right? But we are co-designing the experience. We're thinking about different levers of like, how are you using the space? What artifacts are we using? How are the students moving? How do we want them to feel through an experience? And actually, when we hear someone commenting, like oftentimes they think of like, oh, that was the part that you taught Leticia or that you taught another colleague, and it's like, no, that was just kind of like the delivery, but it was just a little piece of a
Awesome.
of a holistic way of thinking about creating that space.
Yeah. I love that as like a generative space. And you made so many great points there. I often feel as educators, we often teach how we learned, and so we learn particular ways.
Yeah.
We end up in the same mental model. And I'd often wonder about the kind of mindset or the mental model for learning and what we're operating on. Is it kind of a I teach, they learn instructor type understanding, or is it I create an experience in which people learn? Maybe that they choose to learn. We start to bring learner agency and then social connectedness and belonging into this whole piece. So really that generative space of even something at the core of our work, Leticia, as well. How do you feel this?
Oh, sorry about that. No, and you were saying like, I teach, you learn, and you might learn something that, is beyond or different than what I wanted you to learn. And that's fantastic, right? Like, so being kind of like open and attuned to that is like, what are students really learning? And sometimes like, if it's in a lecture that is very sort of like one way, they might learn how excited you are about the topic and like nothing more, right? Like, so yeah,
which can be inspiring, I guess, in part.
I mean, absolutely, right? Like they could say like, wow,
well,
this
they love that topic.
exactly, maybe I should look into it.
Yeah, that's really true. I want us to get to this because I feel like this is the piece around like us moving from, teachers as the best knowers to educators as the best learners. And even the whole notion that I'm teaching, like we are always part of the same learning experience, even if we are co-designing it. And so we're always in a evolutionary state, a state of ongoing learning. And so I often think about that in the way that we think about the work that we do is, are we considering ourselves as part of this learning process? Or do we see ourselves as separate from it? Because I think the moment we see ourselves as separate, we start to change the way that we interact. We're doing to instead of being with. And to your earlier point on language, which I'm obsessed by, as it's like those prepositions, they matter because it's the relationship between concepts and constructs then. And I guess on that final point is this collection number 3 of like envisage. So the envision, like how do we collectively envisage the future, especially when we think about reflection? It's often thought of as the past, but it's also, as as we both think about, and both big fans of Lisa K. Solomon, of course, who's also been on the podcast, and kind of the futures literacy space. So take us a little bit into the power of reflection to actually build a different kind of future for ourselves, our learners, our schools, our universities, our world.
Right. And you mentioned Lisa. Yeah, Lisa is a very dear colleague at the D School. And we were fortunate that she brought to us the wealth of the methods in futures thinking, and really a way of thinking about the future that really, for me, it was like game changing, right? And it really impacted my work. And it's reflected in the book as well. And really, like, if you think about it, I'm hoping that 100 years from now, someone will look back at education system today, and it's like, and will say like, can you believe that they only used to teach about the past? It's like, wow, right? That's crazy, right? Like, and can we teach about the future, right? Like, that hasn't happened. Absolutely, right? Like, we not only can, but we must, right? Because we really need all of our young people to feel the agency that the future is not happening to them, that they are happening to the future, right? And it's going to be, of course, like the result of individual drive and ingenuity and many systemic forces, but ultimately all of those systems are made of people who made decisions, and we really need to kind of like give students that agency of kind of like, yes, you can shape the future, you can make decisions today and choices today, and also because we need we cannot build something that we haven't imagined, right? Like, so we have to activate our imagination to think of many possible futures, many fantastic and desirable futures, and also scary futures that we need to work to prevent, right? And so I think that's such a kind of like shift for me, and I'm like I really love the last part of the book, the 4 experiments on envisioning, because it really I'm hoping that is something that will be more and more part of like a normal part of our education system, and yes, and kind of like thinking about how we even think about the concept, for instance, of intergenerational collaboration and intergenerational empathy, right? Like, how can we really keep in mind like the many generations to come, and like how our what we do today will affect them, right? And that this comes from indigenous thinking, right? Like, it's not something new, it's something that has been around for many, many years in traditional cultures, but that we need to kind of like bring back and honor fully.
I remember the 7-generation thinking, which is something I've heard from our First Nations here in Australia. And I think Roman Kresnich as well, the be a good ancestor is part of that idea. One of the experiments that I really loved was even just the hypothesis of prospective psychology. Think about what's something you're working on that's due within 5 days. Why are you doing it? If it's successful, who's going to think about something you want to achieve in the next 5 years? Oh, why are you doing that? And if you're successful, will benefit. And then finally think of a project you could start, but that would take 100 years to complete. It's so powerful. Like that, it's just that extension. And I've heard this described sometimes as cosmic time perspective. It's like the idea of and almost cosmic time therapy, which when you realize actually maybe, as egoic as we sometimes get this, I need to finish this piece. Do we? Is it actually in service of the future that we want? Kind of just, I think, lightening our grasp on that. Such a wonderful
Yeah, and the question there on the kind of like, what's a project that would take 100 years? The key question there is like, who could take, which person in the, a young person could you collaborate with so that they take on, right? Like, what is
Nice.
something that, would take another generation taking over and finishing, right? And I think like we need to think with those, with that kind of ambition, right? Like if we're going to solve the complex problems that face us.
That's beautiful. Brings us to kind of my final question, Leticia, which is as you think about the past, consider the present, and look to the future, what is the takeaway message that you'd like to leave our listeners with, wherever they happen to be in this world?
Yeah. So I'd say work on your learner's resume. In other words, work on understanding yourself as a learner, right? And develop your identity as a learner. What learning strategies work for you, and really work on flexing those learning muscles, because that's what's going to, help you figure out what to do when you don't know what to do, right? And yeah, so that would be my suggestion, my humble idea.
Humble idea. I love it because it so taps into this idea from moving from knowing to learning. And I so often think it's so many of us choose education because we love the process of learning. And then the challenge is somehow retaining that deep curiosity and inquiry, as sometimes the system conditions just are not conducive yet to enable us
Yeah.
to kind of continually do that best work. But it's a beautiful journey today, in reflection and much more. Leticia, thank you so much for your time and for joining us for the Learning Future podcast.
Thank you, Luca.